Well, hello and welcome again to our Christ Baptist Church devotionals that we're doing generally most every day, and we've been going through the books of Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and now we're in Nehemiah. Books that take us from when Israel was taken captivity and when they went back to Jerusalem. And we have touched as well a little bit on the prophet Haggai, as Haggai and Zechariah were prophesying during the time of Ezra, and so we covered a little bit of that. But now we find ourselves in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapter 1, which follows along the lines of Ezra. Now we have to remember that Ezra and Nehemiah aren't exactly chronologically one follows the next, but they're more like intertwined, where Ezra begins at a time of about 520 BC. Actually, Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 begins in 538 BC and takes us all the way through to chapter 6 down to about 516 BC. So almost 20 years it took to get the temple built in Jerusalem. And then at 516 BC, when we hit to chapter 7, we find ourselves in the time where Ezra himself went to Jerusalem in 457 BC. I know there's a lot of these dates in there, but 457 BC is literally some 60 years after they built the temple, and some 80 years from when they went back to Jerusalem at Daniel's prayer. So a lot of time transpired to get to Ezra chapter 7. And then basically Ezra chapter 7 is in that year 457 BC. And that's when he went, and it's the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the Persian king there. And then that takes us now to the book of Nehemiah, which advances 13 more years. And we find ourselves now in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, about 13 years after Ezra chapter 10 took place. And so that's kind of getting the dates there. So we're really about 73 to 75 years after they built the temple under King Darius in 520, and probably about 95 years from when Cyrus had told them to go back. And that's where we find ourselves now in Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 1. So remember, it's about 444 to 445 BC. It's been about 13 years since Ezra really started reforms and got things going in Jerusalem again. And here we are in Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 1. The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. Let's stop there for a moment. So what we see here, it's important to mark in your Bibles, it's the 20th year, where we know in Ezra chapter 7 verse 4, or excuse me, Ezra chapter 7 verse 7, it says, in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. So that's how we get our 13 years, from the 7th year when Ezra went back to now the 20th year in the month of Chislev. He was in Susa, the capital. Susa is the capital of the Persian Empire. It's where Daniel was at times, and Daniel had his dream there in the 10th of chapter 10 of Daniel, and so it's also where Esther was. And so he's in Susa, the capital, and he meets a man named Hanani, one of his Jewish brothers there, but people who had come from Jerusalem. They'd made the trek from Jerusalem there, and so he knew recently what had been happening in Jerusalem, and so he asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped. So obviously there was some problem, there was an altercation there, and there were some Jews that escaped and surviving the captivity, and about Jerusalem. So he talked all about the Jewish state of affairs and what's going on. Well, this man answered in verse 3, they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. Now what's important to note here, in Ezra chapter 7, they went there, and it took them about 5 months to get there, 4 or 5 months to get there, and they ended up building they built the temple. If you remember, they had the foundations built in chapter in chapter 3 or 4. They built everything up in 520 BC, so quite a ways earlier they'd actually built the temple. But when Ezra got there, they were now gearing up, and they'd been going for a while. They had several stops and starts, and now they were building things up. So at Ezra chapter 7, he was given permission and actually instructions from the king to go to Jerusalem and to build it up. Okay, so he wants them to go there and start implementing the law of God there. Well, that was 13 years before. And now it's broken down. There's a remnant. There are people who are escaping. There's persecution. And we say, what's happening? How did this happen? Because everything was going fine under Ezra. Well, if we go back to Ezra chapter 4, remember Ezra chapter 4 is not necessarily chronological. Ezra chapter 4 is telling us how much opposition the Jews had. And we see them having the opposition not too long after Cyrus gave them an order to go back. The next king was against them, and the people were against them. They wrote letters and decrees to have them stop. But we also see in verse 6 and 7 that in the reign of Ahasuerus, that's under Esther, and it makes sense that they were being harassed under Esther because of the decree of Haman. And then verse 7 we also see in the days of Artaxerxes. Oh, this is interesting. In the days of Artaxerxes, people there wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and we see their letter in verses 8 to 23. We covered that. And so we know that there was a letter written to King Artaxerxes sometime in Artaxerxes' reign that basically the people were telling Artaxerxes that it's a really bad move to let Jerusalem be built up. And Artaxerxes replied to them saying, I agree. I don't think it should be built up. You're right. He said in verse 21 of chapter 4 of Ezra, he says, so thou issue a decree to make these men stop work, that the city may not be rebuilt until a decree is issued by me. So he said, have them stop until I can give the go-ahead to go ahead. This had to have happened then during the 13-year interval between Ezra chapter 10 and Nehemiah 1 verse 1. Those 13 years. During that time, Ezra had gone back. Things were going. He had solved the problem with the mixed marriages. But somehow in those 13 years, that's when we see that there was a letter written, Ezra chapter 4, a letter written to Artaxerxes by these people conspired, and not only did they stop, but the enemies surrounding Jerusalem now converged in and attacked. And they broke the walls down, and they caused destruction. And you think, how could God allow that when he promised that when after 7 years they'd go back to Jerusalem? Yes, he did. But he also promises that if you will not obey me and you will not follow my law, I will not be with you. Well, what we just see out of Ezra chapter 10, mixed marriages, Ezra 9 and 10, mixed marriages. They were not following God's law. They went back to Jerusalem, but they also went right back to their old ways, which means God says, I'm not with you to protect you. So here we are in Nehemiah chapter 1, and he finds out that there's a huge problem. When he was thinking that under Ezra things would be great, but it wasn't. And so he said that the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, gates are burned with fire. So Nehemiah verse 4, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. He was continually, notice this, for days. That's kind of the key word there. I wept and mourned for days. It wasn't a one-time event. Let's have a prayer meeting. Let's meet on this day and pray this one time. No, this is what was consuming his days and weeks. And throughout the day he prayed, he fasted. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So he continually was doing this. And so That's his attitude. It wasn't a once-off prayer meeting or let's just cover this. We do this one time in prayer. This is a man who said, this situation's so serious, my life needs to be continuously in prayer and fasting, seeking God. So he said in verse 5, I said, I beseech you, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who preserves a covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Interesting how he starts by addressing God about who God is. Great and awesome, but specifically as it relates to Nehemiah and his needs coming up. He's a God who keeps covenant. He's a God who keeps his word. Preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. All those people. And he prays in verse 6, says, let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now day and night. I'm not stopping. He's like the widow and the unjust judge. He's going to keep coming. He wants to make sure God has heard his prayer on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants. And initially, to be able he's appealing to God's character of being a covenant-keeping God. He says, we're confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we've sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. So he's not saying, yeah, it's those people who've done this, God. He's saying, we've not had the right attitude. No doubt he heard about the mixed marriages that Ezra had to deal with. He knows his people are stubborn, and many don't even want to go back. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. You see what he does? He doesn't begin with saying, God, why is this happening? As if there's something wrong in the universe, something wrong in God's will. Everything was right in terms of Nehemiah, and he's saying, God, what's wrong with you? He doesn't start that way. Boy, we have to watch that in our prayers, don't we? When we start asking God, why are things the way they are, because we're immediately challenging as if we have all the information and he's missing some information. And we're trying to remind him, no, Nehemiah is saying, we understand you got all the information and there is obviously sin in the camp because that's who you are. If you're a covenant-keeping God, you'll make sure you keep us in line in terms of how we handle sin. And so he says, we've sinned against you. I and my father's house. I'm not absent. I'm not talking about I'm like a referee or an umpire here. No, this is all of us here. We understand when we approach God, we need to approach him. And here's the application. When we approach God, we have to approach him knowing that he has all the information we don't. Knowing that he is good. We generally are not that good. Knowing that his goodness and his loving kindness goes way beyond anything we can imagine. But his holiness is something we can't even begin to understand because we don't aspire to his holiness. We know our own lives, and so we begin with a proper confession which has no sense of why, God, no sense of why is this happening, no sense of judgmentalism to him. We've acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. He's acknowledging all of that. Ezra chapter 10, he's acknowledging all of that. That's been our history. But then he appeals to God's character. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples, which he did. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I've chosen to cause my name to dwell. He's saying, you're the kind of God that when people do turn, like in Esther, and the people had turned, it doesn't matter how far away they are. It doesn't matter their tough predicament at all. I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I've chosen to cause my name to dwell. So, this is what he's doing. He's appealing to Moses' words in Deuteronomy. It says, when the people turn, God will act this way, and he's appealing for that. They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. These are the same people that you redeemed out of Egypt, and they were stiff-necked back then as well. They're the same people, the same ones. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. Now that's the part you can look at to gear up to understand Nehemiah chapter 2, when we go to tomorrow's devotion. He's saying, I want your ear to be attentive to this prayer, because here's what my prayer is. My prayer is, make me, Nehemiah, grant me favor so that Artaxerxes has compassion on me. Artaxerxes is who this man is in verse 11. Him is Nehemiah. And so he's saying, I want you, God, your ear to be attentive to the prayer of Nehemiah your servant, and the prayer of your servants. Those are all the people here who delight to revere your name, and make Nehemiah your servant successful today, and grant Nehemiah compassion before Artaxerxes I. That's what I'm asking for. And he tells us all this in the last sentence. Now I was the cupbearer to the king. That's why he's asking, because he's in a position of favored status. Nehemiah's going to use his position. It's, again, just like the book of Esther, he's at high risk, and he's asking God to give him compassion from Artaxerxes, because the walls are broken down, something's got to happen. Nehemiah's going to ask about rebuilding. Now, you want to ask and say, why are the walls broken down? Why? All because of just God said, well, yes, but what was the reason Artaxerxes knocked the walls down? Well, historically we know that there was a revolt in Egypt in the Persian Empire. A revolt by the Syrians and Egypt, so it's pretty close by Israel. And this happened about 5 years before this date, where this rebellion took place. So the king was clamping down. So with that rebellion that took place about 5 years earlier, naturally the enemies around Jerusalem were giving Ezra trouble. They wrote a letter, and they said, man, you don't want rebellion. You want more rebellion than what you've got in Syria and Egypt? You don't want to have that. And so things were shut down. And that's why once they got shut down, then the enemies were able to really harass unimpeded by the law, and they tore down the walls, burned the gates, that kind of thing. And it's all under the idea of you're just like the Syrians, you're just like the Egyptians, you want to rebel against the king. Because that's what they wrote in their letter, Ezra chapter 4. This nation is a rebellious people, they will cause harm to the king, that kind of thing. Well, that's what happened historically under Egypt and Syria nearby. So the king shut it all down. Well, after 5 years, that rebellion was put to bed. That rebellion was stopped. So it had been quiet now for a while, a number of years. So now, Nehemiah hears about how the place is just really torn apart. Nehemiah is going to ask the king, and it's dangerous. Why? Well, because the king was highly concerned about the rebellions occurring nearby Egypt 5 years before. Well, if that's the case, what's his mindset going to be now? I don't know. You better, Lord, I pray you grant me compassion from this man. I really need to have him in my relationship with him that he'll trust. I pray that'll happen. So that's what happened historically. God used that rebellion to actually provide discipline on Israel because they weren't following him. And God showed that I'm not with you. So that letter was written, and Artaxerxes came and shut it down, and the place got torn apart. Then here it is, 5 years later, the rebellion is quiet. Nehemiah's in the right place, and he is risking not just his job, but his life. So he's appealing to the God of Scripture. He's confessing, knowing, in a complete confession, I don't have all the information, you do, God. And I'm trusting you in your goodness. And in who you are, that if we follow this, you'll be the God of the covenant with Israel. That's what we see in Nehemiah chapter 1 as we get started, 13 years after Ezra chapter 10. So I hope you get an idea of how the flow is going here. Everybody's always at risk. When you follow the Lord in a hostile world, it's always at risk. So we'll see you tomorrow when we get to Nehemiah chapter 2.